The early winter sun hung low over the mesas, casting long shadows across the Broken Creek ranch. Snow had just begun to dust the fences, the barn roofs, and the dry earth, turning the horizon into a pale wash of white and gold. Ezra Holt stood on the porch of the main house, hands gripping the weathered wood of the railing, staring into the distance. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his frame carved by years of labor under the relentless New Mexico sun. His face carried lines like the etched canyons in the hills around him, hard-earned, weathered by loss, and by the life of a rancher who carried the burden of land, livestock, and men who depended on him. 3 winters had passed since his wife, Clara, had succumbed to a fever that swept through the territory in days. The house had been silent ever since, her laughter and voice lingering in the rooms like ghosts. Ezra had learned to live with that silence, just as he had learned to live with droughts, with broken fences, and with the ever-looming threat of Sela's Crow's syndicate, a force moving south to buy struggling ranches and water rights. The ranch itself looked formidable to any passerby, a fortress of timber and stone, reinforced fences, and a house that suggested permanence, but Ezra knew better. Behind every beam and fence post was struggle, scarcity, and the faint, constant hum of worry. He was thinking of the northern tank, low and slowly drying, when movement caught his eye. A figure appeared on the road, small against the vast white expanse, leading a horse that limped slightly, her dark skirt dusted with snow, her hat pulled low. She walked steadily, without hesitation, without fear. Ezra narrowed his eyes. It was unusual for anyone to travel alone this far into the territory, especially in winter. Ezra stepped down from the porch, boots crunching on the frozen gravel, hands brushing the rough leather of his gun belt. The woman stopped about 10 feet away. She was slight, wiry, but there was a determination in her posture that made Ezra pause. Her eyes were dark, sharp, assessing. She looked at his revolver, then at his hands, then at his stance, measuring whether he was a man to be challenged or avoided. "I'm looking for work," she said. Her voice was husky, dry from the road, but steady. Ezra squinted. "I'm not hearing cooks," he said flatly. "We have a washerwoman who comes out once a month." "I'm not a cook," she said. "I'm a horse trainer. I can break anything with 4 legs and a bad temper. My name is Clara Morgan. I'll work for half pay until you see what I can do." Ezra studied her carefully. She was slight, almost fragile-looking, yet there was a strength in the set of her shoulders, a steadiness in her movements. She didn't fidget. She didn't speak too fast or too loud. In a land that demanded toughness, her calm was its own kind of defiance. "Bring the horse to the trough," Ezra said finally, "and get yourself some water while you're at it. You look like you could use it." As she led the horse through the gate, Ezra noticed a faint scar peeking from beneath her collar, a raised, angry line running from her neck down toward her shoulder. She caught his glance and quickly pulled the collar higher. "Don't look there," she said softly but firmly. Ezra stepped back, silently respecting the space she demanded. "The tack room at the end of the supply barn is yours," he said, "separate from the main house. Heavy door, bolt inside. You'll have the only key. You work, you're paid, and if you can't do the job, you move on." She nodded slowly as if weighing each word. "I can do the work," she said. The first test. The next morning, the men gathered at the breaking pen. Word had spread quickly that the new hire was going to ride the Baron, a sorrel gelding notorious for throwing even the strongest hands on the ranch. Pike, the foreman, grinned, spat into the dirt, and muttered to the men, "10 seconds, that's all she lasts." Clara entered the pen calmly. No saddle, no whip. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, as if she respected the space she was entering. The Baron pinned his ears back and swung his hindquarters, snorting violently. The men laughed, whispering bets and predictions, but Clara didn't flinch. She circled slowly, keeping her hands flat against the horse's shoulders. She hummed, a soft, low, rhythmic tune that seemed to reach the animal's instincts rather than dominate it. Minutes passed. The horse stiffened, pawed at the ground, snorted, but Clara remained patient. When she vaulted onto his back in a single fluid motion bareback, the horse bucked violently, spinning and thrashing. Dust and snow swirled around her, yet she stayed centered, moving with the horse rather than against it. Finally, the gelding settled, its sides heaving, head lowered, and Clara's calmness radiated outward. She slid from his back, patting his neck gently, never looking at the men. The echo of silence hung over the pen. Ezra set down his tin cup of coffee and nodded. Enough, back to work. Boone muttered something about tricks or witchcraft, but Ezra's gaze silenced him. She works for me, respect her, or leave. The men fell silent. Clara led the horse back to the trough, still humming softly, her presence quiet but undeniable. Settling in. Days passed. Winter deepened. Snow drifted against the barn, the corrals, the fences. Clara's skills became indispensable. She calmed colts, healed minor injuries, and tended to the sick and injured. She seemed to know instinctively which animals needed her most. Ezra watched her from the shadows of the barn. He noticed the small details, the curve of her jaw as she concentrated, the way her fingers brushed her hair away, the gentle firmness of her hands on a struggling colt. He felt a strange, protective awareness for her, though he didn't yet know why. Conversations were sparse. They shared only what needed to be said: horses, feed, fences, and schedules. But there was an unspoken rhythm between them. Mutual respect, trust, and the quiet acknowledgement of each other's strength. One evening, after a long day in the cold, Ezra found Clara sitting on a hay bale in the barn, brushing a mare. The fire from the stove cast long shadows across her face. "You should eat," he said softly. "I will," she replied, "but just one more minute." He stayed, just watched. Her movements were precise and graceful, each touch measured. She hummed again, and it filled the empty barn with a strange warmth. For the first time in years, Ezra felt a spark of life inside his chest that wasn't just the fire's heat. The storm approaches. Weeks passed. Snowstorms grew heavier. The wind whistled across the mesas, rattling fences and making the creek thin to a trickle. One late afternoon, Ezra and Clara checked the northern fence line. Snow had drifted high against it, and the cold bit at their fingers. Together, they repaired broken posts and tightened wires. They worked in silence, communicating in gestures, glances, and movements rather than words. Every so often, Clara would glance up, smile faintly, and Ezra would feel a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. That night the wind rose into a storm. Snow rattled the house. Ezra blocked the door when Clara tried to step outside. "I'll leave at dawn," she whispered. He shook his head. "Not alone," he said quietly but firmly. Clara froze, searching his face. There was no anger, only concern, only a promise he didn't yet understand himself. They watched the snowstorm together in silence, sharing a small warmth by the fire. Outside, the ranch was covered in ice and white. Inside, the barn and house were alive with quiet companionship and tentative trust. The beginning of something new. Winter slowly gave way to early spring. Horses calmed, the creek ran clear, and the ranch found a fragile rhythm again. Clara was no longer a stranger. She was part of the ranch, part of the rhythm, part of Ezra's life. Small moments, an accidental touch while feeding horses, a shared laugh over a spilled bucket, a quiet glance across the barn, spoke more than words ever could. Slowly, a bond formed, fragile and tentative, yet undeniable. Ezra had learned to carry grief, and Clara had learned to survive rejection. Together, they began learning something new: trust, belonging, and perhaps, one day, love. The sun rose over the Broken Creek Ranch, casting gold across snow and fences. Ezra and Clara stood side by side, watching the herd graze. Fingers brushed lightly. She didn't pull away. He didn't let go. Outside, the world could be harsh and unforgiving. Inside, there was warmth. Inside, there was home. And neither would leave the other, not at dawn, not ever. Winter had taken hold of Broken Creek Ranch. Snow lay thick across the mesas, frozen ruts marking where the cattle had trudged, fences bowed under the weight of ice, and the creek had narrowed to a frozen ribbon. Ezra Holt moved through the ranch with a quiet efficiency. He checked the water troughs, adjusted fences, and ensured the men were keeping the herd in line. The cold bit at his fingers, the wind whistled across his neck, and yet he felt alive in the way only work could bring. Clara Morgan, or Clara Holt, as he had taken to calling her in private, had become indispensable. She moved through the barn with a practiced ease, calming colts, tending to the older mares and quietly mending broken harnesses. She worked without complaint, her hands steady and precise, and her presence had a calming effect on both animals and men. One late afternoon, a sudden storm rolled in from the north. The sky darkened as clouds thickened, wind whipping loose snow into the air. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Ezra and Clara were outside, checking the northern fence line. "We need to get the stragglers in," Clara said, pulling her coat tighter. Her voice was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "The herd will scatter if the wind hits full force." Ezra nodded. "I'll take the east side, you handle the west." They moved through the snow silently, each knowing the other's rhythm. The cattle were skittish, their breath steaming in the cold air, hooves slipping on icy patches. Clara moved among them, her voice low, gentle, guiding them toward the pens. Ezra watched her, noticing how her hands, though small, radiated authority and care. When one stubborn calf broke away, Clara approached it calmly, kneeling in the snow to meet its eyes. "Easy," she murmured. The calf trembled for a moment, then relaxed under her presence. Ezra felt a flicker of warmth for her courage and admiration. That evening, after the storm had passed, Ezra built a fire in the cabin. The wind still howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the warmth was steady. Clara sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "You're getting better," Ezra said quietly, taking a seat across from her. She looked up, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "At what?" "Everything," he said. "Riding, handling the herd, surviving this winter." Clara laughed softly, the sound like a bell in the quiet room. "I've had to learn fast." Ezra studied her for a moment, noticing the shadows under her eyes, the faint scar on her neck, and the way she kept herself contained. He realized that this woman, rejected, alone, hardened by life, was slowly trusting him. He leaned back, the firelight dancing across his face. "You don't have to hide anymore, not here." Clara's hands tightened around her mug. Her eyes met his, searching, hesitant. "I'm not used to this," she admitted. "To trust someone again." Ezra nodded slowly. "I understand, but you can, and you don't have to do it alone." The next morning, Ezra and Clara worked together in the barn. A mare had gone lame during the storm. Pike had suggested they put her down, but Clara had refused. She moved around the animal with gentle authority, cleaning the wound, applying salves, and keeping the mare calm. Ezra watched quietly, noticing how she spoke to the animal as if it could understand every word. "She'll be fine," Clara said softly. "Just needs time and care." Ezra felt a deep respect for her. This wasn't just skill, it was empathy, patience, and courage. When the work was done, the barn was quiet except for the sound of hooves and the occasional creak of the roof under snow. Ezra and Clara stood together, their shoulders brushing slightly. Neither moved away. Neither spoke. In that moment, the world outside, the harsh wind, the frozen land, the lonely ranch, felt distant. They were not alone. Weeks passed. Snow melted slowly, the creek ran clearer, and the herd found its rhythm again. But something had shifted between Ezra and Clara. It was subtle, a lingering glance, a hand brushing against another, quiet smiles in the barn. One evening, Ezra found Clara sitting by the fire, stitching a torn saddle pad. He sat beside her, not touching, just being near. "Ezra?" she asked softly. "Yes." She hesitated. Then, I was afraid I'd never belong anywhere again." Ezra turned to her, meeting her eyes. "You belong here," he said quietly. "With the ranch, with me, and you never have to leave alone." Her hand hovered near his for a moment, then rested on her lap. I want to stay," she admitted. Ezra gave a small, steady nod. "Then stay, not for me, not for the ranch, but because this is your home too." The firelight flickered across their faces. Outside, the snow was melting, but inside, warmth and trust were building slowly, brick by brick. Life at Broken Creek Ranch settled into a rhythm. The men learned to respect Clara, not just for her skill, but for her quiet strength and courage. Pike still grumbled, but he no longer mocked her. Toby and Dutch began seeking her advice on handling horses. The ranch was no longer just Ezra's domain. It was a small community, a found family. Ezra watched this quietly, realizing that trust and care could rebuild what loss had broken. Clara had brought not only her skills but her heart into the ranch, and slowly they were healing together. One evening, as the sun set behind the mesas, Ezra and Clara walked together to the barn. The horses were calm, the men had gone in for supper, and the wind carried only a whisper of cold. "You stay," Ezra said, breaking the quiet. "I am staying," Clara replied, her voice soft but sure. And for the first time, Ezra felt a peace he hadn't known since Clara Morgan's death years ago. The Broken Creek Ranch, under snow and storm and wind, was no longer just land and buildings. It was a home, a place of trust, a place where two people, once broken and alone, had found each other. Ezra and Clara stood side by side, watching the horses graze in the clearing. Fingers brushed. She didn't pull away. He didn't let go. Outside, the world could still be harsh, unforgiving, and wild. Inside, there was warmth. Inside, there was love, quiet, patient, slow, and enduring. And neither would leave the other, not at dawn, not ever. Spring had finally begun to thaw Broken Creek Ranch. The snow had melted into the creek, turning it from a frozen ribbon into a silver ribbon reflecting the morning sun. The mesas glowed soft gold and green, and life stirred in the fields once more. Ezra Holt and Clara Morgan, or Clara Holt, as she now called herself quietly, had settled into a rhythm. The men respected her skill with horses and cattle, and the ranch was no longer struggling as it had been through winter. But peace in the territory was always fragile. One afternoon, as Ezra checked the southern fence line with Clara, they spotted two riders silhouetted against the mesa. Dust rose behind them in small clouds. They wore long coats and wide-brimmed hats, the type Ezra recognized instantly. Men who worked for Sela's Crow, the land syndicate that had taken over failing ranches in the region. "They're scouting," Ezra said quietly, tightening his grip on the fence post. "Don't make a sound, just watch." Clara's hand rested lightly on her saddle horn. "Do we run?" "No," Ezra replied. "We watch, we don't panic." The riders circled slowly, glancing at the fence and then at the distant house. They were looking for weakness, for easy prey. But Broken Creek Ranch had no easy prey, not with Clara and Ezra working together. That night, a gust of wind drove cattle from the northern pasture into a narrow canyon. Ezra and Clara were the first to spot them. The snow had left patches of ice along the canyon floor, making movement dangerous. "Follow me," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. "I'll guide them slowly. You block the exits." Together, they moved like a single unit. Clara's soft voice guided the frightened animals. Ezra intercepted a steer that panicked near the edge of the canyon. Every step was careful, every movement deliberate. The storm outside howled, but inside the teamwork there was silence, trust, and unspoken understanding. Slowly, the herd was driven back to the pen. Ezra watched Clara's hands, her posture, and the way she seemed to calm both animal and man with quiet authority. "You saved the herd," he said later, once the animals were secure. "We saved them," Clara replied, giving him a brief smile. Her hands were still trembling slightly from the cold and exertion. After the day's work, the ranch hands had gone inside, leaving Ezra and Clara alone by the fire. The warmth of the cabin was welcome after the cold wind and snow of the past days. "You were remarkable today," Ezra said quietly, tossing a small log onto the fire. Clara looked down at her hands, brushing the dirt from her sleeves. "It's just what I know how to do. I've had to survive on my own." Ezra leaned back, studying her face in the firelight. "You don't have to be alone anymore." Her eyes met his, searching, vulnerable for just a heartbeat. "I've been told I'm too stubborn, too independent too," she paused, as if uncertain of the words. "Strong," Ezra offered gently. She nodded, a small, wry smile tugging at her lips. "Yes, too strong sometimes." Ezra's voice was low. "You're strong, yes, but you don't have to carry the world alone. Not here, not with me." A quiet moment stretched between them. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin, but inside, time slowed. Their fingers brushed as Clara reached for a towel to dry her hands. Neither pulled away. Days later, the two riders returned, more boldly this time. They circled the ranch, eyes scanning the fences, the barns, and the house. Ezra saw them first from the porch, and he didn't hesitate. "Clara, the men are getting uneasy," he said. "I need you in the barn tending the animals. Keep them calm." "I'll help you," she said firmly, her eyes narrowing. "No," he replied. "You stay with the herd, that's your strength, trust me. I'll handle them." The riders were looking for a fight, for weakness, but Ezra and his men were ready. Fences were reinforced, gates bolted, and the men were on alert. The riders circled once, twice, then slowly turned and rode away. They had learned that Broken Creek Ranch was not an easy target. That night, Ezra and Clara sat together outside the main house. The sky was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast western night. "You're brave," Ezra said quietly, handing her a cup of coffee. Clara smiled faintly. "I've had to be. Life doesn't wait for anyone." "You don't have to face it alone anymore," Ezra said, his voice soft but steady. Clara's gaze lingered on his face, on the lines and shadows that told of years of hard labor, grief, and responsibility. I like being here," she admitted. "With you, with the ranch." Ezra reached for her hand, this time letting it linger, "and we're better for it together." They sat in silence, watching the firelight flicker over the frozen fields and the ridge beyond. Outside, the world was harsh. Inside, there was warmth, trust, and something fragile but growing, something neither had dared to name fully yet. Over the following weeks, their bond grew stronger. Small gestures became intimate, sharing blankets in the barn, a hand on the shoulder while repairing fences, quiet conversations over coffee before dawn. Trust, once scarce, now grew steadily between them. The ranch hands noticed the change. Respect deepened into quiet admiration. Pike, grumbling, softened. Toby's laughter grew more frequent, and even Dutch nodded with approval when Clara calmly corrected a mishandled colt. Ezra realized that her presence wasn't just helpful, it was healing. She brought life, hope, and warmth into the ranch, into the men, and slowly into him. One evening, after a long day of work, Ezra and Clara walked to the barn together. The horses were calm, the sun setting behind the mesas, and the sky glowing in soft shades of pink and gold. Ezra stopped and looked at Clara. "You stay," he said softly, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. "I am staying," she replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. They reached the barn, opened the gates, and walked inside side by side. Horses nickered softly, brushing against their hands. The men had already gone in for the evening, leaving the ranch to its quiet peace. Outside, the world could still be harsh and unforgiving. But inside, at Broken Creek Ranch, there was warmth, family, and a love that had been built slowly, patiently, and quietly. And neither would leave the other, not at dawn, not ever.